The cafe was busy that morning, a jumble of footsteps, ringing phones, and steaming cups. But Maya felt like the only one in the world. She had chosen the corner booth out of habit, a safe, secluded space where no one would look twice at her. From there, she watched as the place came to life around her. Friends greeting each other with hugs, colleagues talking over laptops, parents holding tiny hands and juggling trays of muffins. It was a symphony of connections, and she was just an observer. Maya glanced down at her own table. A single cup of coffee sat untouched. No one to share it with. No one to tell her about their day or ask about hers. The seat across from her might as well have been filled with a ghost, a reminder of the people who had once been there. A year ago, Maya had a small circle of close friends. They used to meet every Saturday for brunch. They used to text her just because they saw a funny meme that reminded them of her. But slowly, imperceptibly, those moments faded. One friend got busy with work, another moved out of state, and others just drifted. Birthdays passed unnoticed, invitations went unanswered, and the group chats went silent. Now, she wasn't sure who would even pick up the phone if she called. She had tried not to let it bother her. People grow apart. It happens, she told herself. But the emptiness gnawed at her. She started believing that the problem was her some fundamental flaw in her personality that made her forgettable, unlovable. Even the baristers at the cafe barely recognized her anymore, despite her daily visits. She felt like she was fading, like her voice didn't matter, like she could scream and no one would hear. The other tables were filled with laughter, the kind that came from years of inside jokes and shared experiences. Maya couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed like that. She stared into her coffee, her reflection rippling in the dark liquid. Her chest ached with a loneliness that no amount of caffeine could cure. A sharp laugh from a nearby table made her look up. A group of friends sat clustered together, leaning in, their voices mingling in lively conversation. For a fleeting moment, Maya imagined sliding into that booth, joining their laughter, adding her own stories. But just as quickly, the thought dissipated. They wouldn't want me there. I'd be an outsider. They're fine without me. She glanced at her phone. No new messages, no missed calls. She knew it was time to leave, but she couldn't bring herself to stand up. What was the point of leaving anyway? There was no one waiting for her at home. No one expecting her. No one who would even notice. She stayed seated, staring into her cup until the noise of the cafe became a dull hum. Maya walked into the same cafe the next morning, unsure why she had even come. It had become a routine, almost a habit, more than anything else. The baristas knew her usual order by now, plain black coffee, and she didn't have to say much. That suited her fine. She liked the predictability, the sense of blending in, though she couldn't shake the feeling of invisibility that followed her. Today, though, something unusual happened. Just as she reached the counter to place her order, the barista handed her a frothy cappuccino instead of her usual. "Wait," Maya began. "I think there's been a mistake. I ordered black coffee." Before the barista could respond, a warm, steady voice came from the side. "I'll take the cappuccino. Make her coffee the way she likes it." Maya turned, and her breath caught. There he was, Denzel Washington. She had seen him on countless screens, heard his powerful speeches, admired his steady confidence. And now he was standing a few feet away, smiling kindly at her as if this was the most normal thing in the world. She blinked, certain she had to be mistaken. But there was no mistaking the way he carried himself, the calm authority that made it impossible to look away. He gave her a small nod. "Go ahead. I've got it." Stammering out a quick thank you, she took her new coffee once the barista corrected the order. Denzel was still there when she turned back, casually leaning against the counter. He motioned to a table and said, "Mind if I sit with you for a minute?" Still too shocked to refuse, she nodded. They sat together, and Maya felt every muscle in her body tighten. She kept waiting for him to say something typical, something celebrity-like. But instead, He simply asked, "How are you doing?" The question seemed almost too simple, too personal. She hesitated, then offered a half-hearted, "I'm fine." He leaned back and studied her. That's the easy answer. But is it the real one? Maya looked down at her coffee. The steam swirled up, almost obscuring her reflection. She finally let out a small sigh. I guess it's not. It's just, I've been feeling really alone, and I don't know how to fix it. Denzel nodded slowly, as if he understood without needing to pry. That's a tough place to be. I'm not going to give you a miracle solution, but I can tell you this. You're not as alone as you think you are. Most people feel disconnected at some point, especially if they've been through tough times or have lost their sense of purpose. She swallowed hard, his words resonating in a way she hadn't expected. But how do you change it? She asked softly. I've tried reaching out, but no one seems interested. I don't even know where to start anymore. Denzel gave a faint smile. It starts with you. You don't wait for others to come to you. You take that first step. You put yourself out there, even when it feels awkward, even when it's hard. People respond to authenticity. When you stop trying to prove yourself and just show up as you are, you'll find the right people start to come into your life. He paused, then added, and remember your worth isn't defined by who's sitting at your table. It's defined by how you see yourself, how you treat yourself, and how you show up in the world. If you believe in your own value, it'll start showing. Others will see it too. Maya listened, every word sinking in. She couldn't remember the last time someone had spoken to her like this. Not just kind words, but honest, direct words that felt like they carried real weight. She nodded slowly, almost afraid to let herself believe it. As they finished their coffee, Denzel stood and reached into his pocket, leaving a generous tip on the table. He gave her one last encouraging smile. I don't think you're as invisible as you think you are. You've got a lot to give. Just take that first step. You'll be surprised how far it can take you. And with that, he was gone. Maya sat there, her coffee still warm this time, feeling as though something heavy had lifted. It wasn't a complete transformation, not yet, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a tiny spark of hope. Maya stepped out of the cafe that morning with a subtle sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. Denzel's words played on repeat in her mind. Take that first step. She still wasn't entirely sure what that step was, but it was enough to remind her that staying isolated wasn't her only option. Maybe she didn't have to wait for someone to invite her into their life. Maybe she could start by opening the door to her own. Her first attempt was a simple one. As she walked to the bus stop, she passed a woman with a toddler holding a balloon. Instead of keeping her gaze down, Maya made eye contact and smiled. The woman smiled back. It was a tiny thing, but it felt like a victory. It wasn't about forcing a conversation or seeking validation. It was about showing herself that the world was full of small, positive moments if she chose to notice them. That evening, Maya signed up for a cooking class at a local community center. She'd always loved baking, but for years, she'd only cooked for herself. Being in a room full of strangers made her anxious at first. She felt her palms sweat as she walked in and saw the groups already chatting and laughing. They already know each other, she thought. They don't need me. But then she remembered, it's not about waiting to be needed. It's about showing up. She walked over to a free station, nodded at the woman next to her, and introduced herself. Hi, I'm Maya. Is this your first time here? The woman smiled warmly. It is. I'm Clara. I've been wanting to try this class for months. The two started talking as they measured flour and cracked eggs, sharing little details about their days. Clara mentioned the local farmers market she visited every Saturday and suggested Maya join her sometime. Maya felt a twinge of disbelief someone was inviting her out, but she realized that the moment only happened because she had stepped forward, taken the first step, and opened herself up to it. Encouraged by the positive experience, Maya decided to try volunteering. She signed up to help at a community garden on weekends, something she'd always wanted to do but had never worked up the courage to follow through on. At first, she kept to herself, focusing on planting and watering. But when she saw a man struggling to carry a heavy bag of soil, she offered to help. He introduced himself as Raj, and soon they were trading tips about gardening and laughing about their mutual lack of experience. By the end of the afternoon, Raj invited Maya to join. A group lunch the volunteers held once a month, one smile, one introduction, one small, hesitant hello. Bit by bit, Maya was building a life she never thought she'd have again. People were beginning to recognize her, to wave when they saw her at the garden, or smile when she walked into the cooking class. Slowly, she started to feel like she belonged. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments of doubt, times when she felt like an outsider, or days when her old habits of retreating into herself threatened to resurface. But Maya kept reminding herself of Denzel's advice: believe in your own value. Take the first step, and it was working. Her once empty days were filling with small victories. She wasn't lonely all the time. She wasn't invisible. The connections were still new, still forming, but they were there, and that alone was more than she ever thought possible. 6 months later, Maya stood in her apartment kitchen, hands dusted with flour, chopping fresh basil for a homemade pasta dish. The space smelled warm and inviting, tomatoes simmering on the stove, bread baking in the oven. She glanced at the clock, feeling a mixture of excitement and nervous anticipation. Guests would be arriving soon. Guests, not a single solitary visitor, but a whole group of people who had chosen to spend their evening with her. She set the table in her small living room, mismatched plates and glasses that reflected her eclectic, pieced-together life. A centerpiece of garden flowers sat in a jar, and soft music played in the background. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was hers. She had made it happen. As the first knock sounded at the door, Maya brushed her hands on her apron and opened it to see Lisa from her cooking class holding a basket of homemade bread. "Smells amazing in here," Lisa said with a grin, stepping inside. Behind her was Raj from the community garden, carrying a bottle of wine. "I hope this goes with whatever you're cooking," he said with a wink. Before long, the room was buzzing with conversation and laughter. More people trickled in. Some Maya had met through the cooking class, others through the garden, and a couple of new friends Lisa had introduced her to. Each person brought a little something to share, and soon the table was overflowing with dishes, stories, and smiles. Maya moved through the room, topping off glasses and chatting with her guests. There were moments when she had to remind herself this was real. The once empty seat across from her at the cafe felt like a distant memory. Instead of wondering who would show up, she was surrounded by people who cared about her and who wanted to be here. The quiet, lonely routine that had defined her life was gone. In its place was something beautiful and alive. During dinner, Maya looked around the table, catching bits of conversation. Lisa and Raj discussing their garden projects, another friend sharing a funny story from work, and bursts of laughter rippling through the room. She felt a swelling in her chest, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel for a long time. Pride. Not just pride in the meal she'd made, but pride in how far she'd come. When dessert was served, homemade brownies Maya had baked that morning, she stood and raised her glass. The chatter quieted, and all eyes turned to her. "I just wanted to say thank you," she began, her voice a little shaky. "I'm not really one for speeches, but this means so much to me. A few months ago, I didn't think I'd ever be here surrounded by people I care about, sharing food, laughing. I used to feel so alone. But I've learned something important. Connection doesn't happen by accident. You have to reach out, take chances, and believe that you're worth knowing. So thank you all for being here tonight. You've helped me find something I thought I'd lost." The group cheered and clinked their glasses, and Maya felt a wave of warmth and gratitude. As the conversation resumed, she sat back and took it all in. This wasn't just a dinner party. It was a celebration of transformation, proof that her efforts, her willingness to take the first step, had led to a full, and meaningful life. Her table was no longer empty. It was overflowing with joy.